Okay, the Ẓāhir and the Bāṭin, the manifest and hidden, an introduction to Islamic Esotericism. I'll begin with a short benediction in Arabic and its translation, and then we will have I will have a general discussion about this stuff, and then I will open the floor to questions. So, if anything I don't cover and you want to talk about, I can broach it and we can have a long, in-depth discussion afterwards. I'll try to not ramble as much as possible, and if there's anything not connected or disconnected or disjointed in the discussion, by all means, during question time, if you want to ask me to clarify anything, I'm more than happy to. Let me begin with the benediction. Bismillah al-Ahya al-Ajlى. سبحان لكنز المخفي الذي يحب عرف وفي أيام الستة الأزلية الأصلية فاتر السماوات والأرض وما بينهم من نوره حبه حيا بنفس واحدة لا إله إلا هو الأو الآخر الظاهر الباطن وكل شيء هالك إلى نوره وإنما البهاء من الله الفاتر على حواء الأولى وآدم الأول بالجمال والآلاء وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين والسلام على الناورين والحمد لله نور العالمين. In the name of God, the most revivificatively alive, the supreme discloser. Glory be to the hidden treasure, who loves, desires to be known, and within the 6 pre-eternal archetypal days, cosmocratively fashioned the heavens and the earth and what is between them by a single soul. No other God is there but it, the first, the last, the manifest, the hidden, and all things perish but its light. And the splendor from the Godhead, the Creatrix, the Cosmocrater, be upon the Primal Eve and the first Adam, with the beauty and the elevation. And then the blessings of God be upon Muḥammad and his family, the pure. Peace be upon the illuminated ones, light givers, and praise be unto God, the light of all the worlds. The Ẓāhir and the Bāṭin, the manifest and the hidden, a running theme throughout all of Islamic Esotericism that basically defines what the world of Islamic Esotericism, the world of irfan or ma'rifah, as it is defined in Arabic, understands by the concept. But I will begin here, before venturing into the definition of the Ẓāhir and the Bāṭin, is that in today's modern or postmodern world, there's a perception of Islam and the Islamic world, as far as the mainstream, that is very much at odds with what the world of ma'rifah, or what the world of Islamic gnosis and esotericism is all about. This has been the case, unfortunately, pretty much from the beginning, so it is not a new development. What has happened in the modern world is that one particular face of Islam has gotten more of the media attention, more of the focus than the others. And also because of the forces of modernism within the Islamic world itself, we find that many of these communities that practice some form of gnosis, whether we're talking about Sufism, or whether we're talking about the various schools of esoteric Shiism and whatnot, have been forced because of circumstances to go underground. Now this is prevalent not just in the Sunni world, it is also the case in a country like Iran, where I come from, where even the Ayatollahs, for all their pretensions to being friendly to the world of irfan or gnosis, have pushed many of the brotherhoods and people who practice various forms of Islamic esotericism into the background. But let me define what I mean by the manifest and the hidden. And I will talk here from a basic phenomenological perspective, a kind of perspective that my hero, the French neuronologist Henri Corbin, would approach the topic. And I will begin with a poem by a 12th, 13th century Egyptian mystic and Sufi by the name of Ibn al-Farid. And in his monumental diwan of poetry, in a particular section of it, or a particular work of it, which is known as the Nazm al-Suluk, the order of wayfaring, he drops the following nugget about what the Ẓāhir and the Bāṭin actually means. He says, and this is a translation of his poem by me, in veils she came forth, hidden by external appearance, in the tincture of color within every germination. At first creation, she showed herself to Adam in the locus of the manifestation of Eve, before the rule of maternity. And there's a lot of different things going on in these lines of poetry by Ibn al-Farid. Number one, that we have the self-disclosure of God at the very beginning, at least in the narrative of the story of Adam and Eve, from the Sufi perspective, and particularly the perspective of Ibn al-Farid, that Eve herself was the tajalli, the self-disclosure of God, the zuhur, the manifestation of God, to Adam as such. And this is playing on the tropes that we have, for example, in the book of Genesis about Eve, where the name Eve itself comes from the acrostic, the Hebrew acrostic, Kol Hay, the mother of all living. And the Sufis particularly, and of the mold of Ibn Farid, who had access to these texts of the Bible, really took the narrative that was already existing within the Quran and just exploded these narratives beyond what many people would expect, where Eve, the eternal woman, the first woman, becomes the trope for the manifestation of God in human form to the first man. And even though the Orthodox and the mainstream mosque and the fuqaha, the jurisconsulates of the law, looked at a lot of these sorts of narratives and stories from the Sufis and other esotericists with a lot of disdain, yet the prevalence of these kinds of views within the world of Islamic esotericism has been there from the very beginning. So I would propose, in a sense, given the fact that these sorts of narratives resonate with similar ones that we have, for example, in India, in the world of Taoism, even in the shamanic worlds, that we're talking about Islamic esotericism, although we are talking about a permutation of a form of esotericism that emerges out of the cultural matrix. But ultimately, we are speaking of esotericism as a meta-religion in its own right, where the Sufis, or not even Sufis, like for example, the sect of the 7 Ismailis, 7 Shiites, can discourse with each other beyond the divides of the confessional religions and the orthodoxies and whatnot. This has always been the case in the Islamic world. This is one of the reasons why, for example, from around the 10th, 11th centuries onwards, when you had Muslims going into India, there were such conversions to Islam within India itself. And it was the Sufis that were converting many of the locals to Islam. The same thing happened in Malaysia, Indonesia, and a lot of these islands. And as far as I understand, that this dynamic was also occurring here in Australia before the arrival of Europeans, when you had these contacts between the Meccans and the Aboriginal people up in Northern Territory and far north Queensland, that we had Aboriginal Muslims, who were being converted by these very syncretic Indonesians, who were practicing both their own shamanic kind of religion and simultaneously a form of Islam that they had received from Sufi missionaries. But that's a whole different conversation, a very interesting historical one. Now, where the phenomena or the phenomenology of the manifest and the hidden needs to be looked at is from the point of view of a triad. What is the thing that connects the inner with the outer? Now, one of the formative experiences that my hero, Henry Corbin, relates, that he had an experience at the lake in Ascona in Switzerland in his youth, when he really began to convert from the study of philosophy to the practice of philosophia in the Platonic sense, is that he had an experience at the lake of what he calls the earth angel woman. That this was the triplicity in which the esoteric path was defined. And it's very interesting because even within the world of esoteric Islam, we have a very similar trajectory where you have the initiation, the transmission, and its realization. Or, a more clearer way of stating this, there is the revelation, the tanzil, the descent from God, which represents the office of prophecy, or nubuwah. Then there is the book, al-kitab. Then there is the return, which is the ta'wil, taking the exoteric back to its foundation in the esoteric, which is in Shiism and also in Sufism, is represented by the station of the walaya, which usually gets translated in English as vicegerency or sainthood, but these terms are extremely misleading because walaya has several different meanings simultaneously. It means both providential guidance as well as love for many of the definitions. And one of the names of God that you find in the Quran and in many of the prayers is Al-Wali, the friend, the lover, the providential guide. Then, as the Alavi Bektashi order of Turkey, one of the very heterodox Shiite orders of Turkey, they define this triplicity as Allah, Muhammad, and Ali. This is the trinity of Alavi Bektashism, as it were. And we find justification, for example, in a lot of the glosses of the Quran itself by many Sufis, many esotericists, from the following verse, the 53rd verse of the 41st surah of the Quran, Fusilat, where God speaks in the first person, سَنُورِهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ إِنَّهُ الْحَقُّ. Soon shall we show them our signs in the horizons and inside themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the real truth, or it is the real. And this has been interpreted by many commentators, this particular verse where the horizons represents the reality of the Sharia, or the law of the path, and in the horizons of the manifest world. And then inside themselves represents the reality of the tariqa, the esoteric path itself. And the real, of course, is the haqiqa, the one thing that then unites both the inner and the outer together. So in some sense, we can take, putting Qurbans in term in there, the earth is to initiation, is to the exoteric revelation, is to Allah or God, which is to the Sharia. The angel is to the transmission, to the book, to Muhammad, the tariqa. And woman is to the transmission or the return, which is the ta'wil, then you get to its esoteric foundation, which is then represented in the world of the archetypes by Fatima or Ali, alayhi salam. Now, when we discuss Islam, what is the meaning of Islam? If one reads the Quran, and then one goes back to the earliest of the Hadith, especially in the Shiite corpus of Hadith, this word, Islam itself, is very tricky. And there is, depending on which of the 7 readings of the Quran one picks, if one, for example, picks the Hafs reading of the Quran, it's one of the 7 readings, then the Hafs was actually transmitted by Imam Ali alayhi salam. Hafs, when you read what the text says, Islam is not a noun. So it's not actually the proper name of a religion. It's actually a process. Islam, it gets translated into English usually as submission, but the word itself, Islam, comes from the triliteral root, as most of the words in Arabic come, salama, which means to be in peace, right? So Islam means to be in a sort of state of radiant acquiescence. And as a verb, rather than as a proper noun, this means that Islam is actually the condition to which every person who recognizes the truth of the message and realizes the reality of the Godhead, Allah, for lack of a better word, the God, is moving upon this path of Islam or istislam, to radiantly acquiescence to the reality of things as they are. There's a prayer that is much beloved by a lot of Sufis that it comes from the Prophet Muhammad. And one of the great Gnostic masters of Iran in the last century basically even glosses the verb Islam, to radiantly acquiesce, based on this prayer by the Prophet Muhammad. The prayer goes like this: Allahumma arna haqaqa al-ashya kama hiya. O Lord, show us the realities of things as they truly are. This master, this Khakstari master, says that this is what the meaning of Islam is. So we're not even speaking of a creed as such. We are speaking of a condition. And this is why a lot of people get confused. For example, when you read the Quranic narrative about revelations of the past, The reason why a lot of people get confused is because the Quran asserts that all the messages that have come from heaven to humanity have all been Islam. Now, that doesn't mean that it's been the same religion. It has been the same meta-religion, as it were, that has come to all peoples throughout the world. This is the particular contextual expression of what that means in the 7th or 6th, 7th century Arabia, in the inspirations and the revelations that the Prophet of Islam was articulating. So what is Islam, in a sense? And that Islam, the radiant acquiescence, can only be understood from its esoteric perspective when one glosses the very first chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, from the intentionality, its esoteric intentionality. And this is the prayer that every Muslim recites every day. If you're a Sunni, 5 times, if you're Shia, 3 times, during your prayers, during the various cycles of the Salat. And the prayer is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful. This benediction has 19 letters. The number 19 is the numerical value of the word wahid, which means one, as well as wujud, existence, right? Now, these 19 letters of the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim are, to the esoteric world of Muslims, the code by which everything is understood. And there's a hadith, a narration by the first Imam Ali alayhi salam, where he states that all of the Quran is contained in the 19 letters of the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful. And all of the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is contained inside the Bismillah, and all of the Bismillah is contained inside the letter Ba, its first letter of the Bismillah. And the letter Ba itself is contained within its dot. The letter Ba is the letter as such, the B of Arabic. It says, I am the dot underneath the letter Ba, right? One of the many famous theopathic sayings of Ali, the first Shiite Imam. The second verse, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise be unto God, the Lord of the worlds. Now, the way that a Shiite esotericist or a Sufi would unpack this is that the Rabbil Alameen, the Lord of the worlds that is being spoken of, is not necessarily the Godhead that is beyond all understanding, is the reality of being itself, is beyond being. Rather, the Lord of the worlds, the Rabbil Alameen, represents the eternal Imam, or rather the archetype, which is, like, for example, in philosophy is called the universal intellect, that embodies itself throughout many eons of history, in particular people, who is a single soul that continually comes. It is the Atman that never ceases from remanifesting itself. There are hadith in the Shiite corpus especially where God says, Awal khalab, or the Prophet Muhammad through the angel says, Awal khalab Allah al-Aql. The first thing that God created was the universal intellect, or the next soul consciousness. Because the word aql in Arabic doesn't necessarily denote the partial intellect. In the earliest understandings of what this word aql means, it was the unfettered reality of things. So a consciousness that is connected to God. Not necessarily, ratiocination in the way that the Hellenistic philosophical concepts understand the concept of the intellect. Then, that hadith itself is glossed by a prophetic hadith attributed to the Prophet, which says, Awa khalaq Allah nuri, the first thing God created was my light. And in the world of Sufism and esoteric Shiism, the light is the first intellect. So the intellect and the light are the same thing. And in the Quran, when we have the very famous light verse that begins with Allahu nur samawati wal-arḍ, the Godhead is the light of the heavens of the world. The way that most of these folks will interpret this is that this refers to the manifestation of the first intellect, that the pre-eternal light that is always present, and who is the initiator. The light that then, diffuses, in a sense, throughout all the true initiators of humanity into the mysteries. And the next verse is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the compassionate, the merciful. And these two words, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, in both the Ismaili and as well as some Sufi commentaries, represents the male-female duality. And especially amongst 12 Shia commentaries on the Bismillah, Ar-Rahman represents the reality of Fatima, alayhi salam, and Rahim is the reality of Ali, alayhi salam. So, Bismillah would be the reality of the Prophet in the name of God. Ar-Rahman would be the reality of Fatima, alayhi salam, and Rahim would be Ali, alayhi salam. And the next verse of it, Malik Yawmuddin, master of the day of judgment. This is usually interpreted, but the word Deen, which is usually translated as religion, actually has a more precise etymology because the word Dain in Arabic denotes debt. So master of the day of the debt. And the gloss on this particular verse of Al-Fatiha by most Sufis is that the life force, the soul that comes into the world, is one who has its life given to it by the Spirit. And the master of that life force is the Godhead. And the master of the God, or the representative in the below, within this world, is the true initiator, the eternal Imam. So the master of the day of the existential debt, in essence, is the one who initiates someone into the path. The debt is repaid when an initiate is initiated and then begins to walk to repay that existential debt to the Spirit, as it were. And the next verse, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. To thee do we render worship, and from thee do we ask for aid. These are the bifurcations of the path. So the existential debt as such, we know what the orientation of the repayment of this existential debt is to. اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمَ. The next verse, guide us upon the straight path. The straight path in most Shiite and Sufi commentaries represents, again, the Imam initiator, or the initiatrix, from the point of view of my order, the Fatimiyya, who is then the straight path, the one who initiates the eternal Imam, whether it be in the form of the woman, the eternal woman, or the male initiator who stands in relation to the Godhead as the mother, or the wife, and in relation to the initiate as the mother. In the final verse, صِرَاطَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. The path upon whom thou hast bestowed thy bounties, the initiation, not those who thou hast shown thy wrath, those gone astray. So, this final passages of Fatiha then divides humanity into two camps. The camp of those who are initiated and who travel the path back to the Spirit, and those who refuse the initiation or corrupt the initiation. And by doing so, bring about for themselves the wrath of the world, which is, contextualized in a kind of a fire and brimstone language, but they bring it upon themselves by denying the reality and refusing to repay the existential debt. This is how Al-Fatiha, the very first chapter of the Quran, is unpacked on a very basic level in the world of Islamic esotericism. Now I'll talk a little bit about the structure or architecture of the Islamic sacred universe from two angles. First angle is the Quranic one, and the next one I'll talk about is from the Shiite angle. And once we get into the world of Sufism, and particularly the Sufism of a figure like Ibn Arabi, the great Andalusian master from the 12th, 13th century, these two perspectives basically become the same, or they get fused and syncretized. But from the point of view of the Quran itself, which in some sense one can interpret all of these cosmologies as being unapologetically Platonist, from the very top stands God, or the God, Allah. Then, from this, underneath God, there are the angels. Then, underneath that, we have the humans, the animals, plants, and minerals that are termed by a single word in Arabic, ins. And then, there's the fourth, and that is the world of the jinn, which are later in later literature are divided into the guardian spirits, the muwakkilun, the devils, the shayateen, demons, afarid, the ghouls or ghoul, and then the marid, the giants. This is the race the various races of the jinn. And the Quran and even the Hadith literature are very unequivocal that that these beings live among us, even though they're unseen. From the point of view of the Shiite sacred universe, this hierarchy of worlds functions as follows. There is the world of the Lahut, or the divine world proper, which is also termed by the Imams the world of the mother of the book. Alana Ummul Kitab. From this emanates forth then what they call the world of the Jabarut, or the world of the Empyrean of powers, the world of the archangelic intellects, the abstract archangelic intellects. Within this world is contained the Arsh, the divine footstool, and Kursi. From this world emerges another world which is called the world of the Malakut, or the angelic world, which is then subdivided into two sections. One is the Elyon, celestial heaven, and then there is the Sijin, which is the celestial hell. So from both the Quranic and Shiite point of view, hell is not a realm that is outside of the purview of the angelic world. The angels actually control both the reality of hell and the reality of heaven. In fact, there's a verse in the Quran where it states that 19 angels guard the entrance to the gates of hell. And then finally, we have the world of the Mulk, or the world of the dominion, otherwise known as the Nasut, or the material world. Now, in the Shiite world, and especially amongst the Sufis, the four phrases that are uttered every day as a prayer at the end of all of the salah, all of the prayers, are taken as being invocations specifically to four of these worlds. So this phrase is in the Shiite world known as the Tasbih al-Fatima, the theophanic praise of Fatima. And the phrase is Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar. Now, within this esoteric world, the first of these phrases, glorified be God, is said to be an invocation to the world of Allahut, the world of the mother of the book. The second one, praise be unto God, Alhamdulillah, is said to be an invocation to the world of the Jabr, the world of the Empyrean. The third one, La ilaha illallah, or the Tahleel, there's no God but God, is said to be an invocation to the angelic world. And then the final one, Allahu Akbar, is said to be an invocation to the realm, the material realm itself. So these four phrases are the four ways by which a Muslim or an esoteric Muslim is in the state of prayer, is invoking these worlds or presencing these worlds to herself or himself. Now, all of this praxis of Islamic esotericism revolves around the practice and the understanding and the realization what the Quran talks about as the Asma al-Husna, the most beautiful names of God. There are 99 of these names that are mentioned within the book itself. Other sources have far more. There's a very popular prayer that I also use myself, and it's very auspicious, especially considered to recite this prayer during the holy month of Ramadan. And this is the prayer of the Dua al-Jawshan al-Kabir, the prayer of the greater steel-coated male, wherein you have 100 verses, and within these 100 verses, there are 1,000 names of God that are recited within this prayer. And this is a prayer much beloved, especially in the Shiite world and in the subcontinent. And you hear Muslims every year during Ramadan constantly reciting this prayer. But as for the 99 names, upon which the practice of all of this revolves, obviously we have the name Allah, which is held by these Sufis and also a lot of Shiite Gnostics to be the outward articulation of the most comprehensive reality of the Godhead, beyond which has no name. Then we have names such as Ar-Rahman, the compassionate, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, Al-Malak, the ruler, Al-Quddus, the holy, As-Salam, the peace, Al-Mu'min, the inspirer of faith, Al-Muhayyimin, the guardian protector, Al-Aziz, the protector, Al-Jabbar, the compeller, Al-Mutakabbir, the haughty, Al-Khaliq, the creator, Al-Bari, the fashioner, Al-Musawwir, the shaper of beauty, Al-Ghaffar, the forgiving, Al-Qahhar, the subduer, Al-Wahhab, the giver of all, Al-Razzaq, the sustainer, Al-Fattah, the opener, Al-Alim, knower of all, Al-Qabis, the constrictor, Al-Basit, the expander, Al-Khafiz, the abaser, Al-Mu'iz, the exalter, Al-Mudhil, the humiliator, Al-Basir, the seer of all, Al-Hakam, the judge, Al-Latif, the subtle or the magnanimous, Al-Khabir, the well-informed, Al-Azim, the mighty, Al-Ghafur, the forgiver and hider of all faults, Al-Shakur, the giver of thanks, Al-Ali, the high, Al-Kabir, the great, Al-Hafiz, the protector or the preserver, Al-Mughit, the nourisher, Al-Hasib, the accounter, Al-Jalil, the mighty or the majestic, Al-Karim, the generous, Al-Raqib, the watchful one, Al-Mujib, the responder, Al-Wasi, the all-comprehending, Al-Hakim, the wise, Al-Wadud, the one loved, Al-Majid, the majestic one, Al-Ba'is, the resurrector, Al-Shahid, the witness, Al-Haq, the truth, Al-Wakil, the trustee, Al-Qawi, the power or the strength, Al-Mateen, the forceful one, Al-Wali, the friend, the lover, or the governor even, Al-Hamid, the one praised, Al-Muhsid, the praiser, Al-Mubdi, or the originator, Al-Mu'id, the restorer, Al-Muhya, the giver of life, Al-Mumid, the taker of life, Al-Hayy, the ever-living, Al-Qayyum, the self-existing or the peerless, Al-Wajid, the finder, Al-Majid, the glorious, Al-Wahid, the one or the unique, Al-Ahad, the one, the indivisible, Al-Samad, the everlasting, Al-Qadir, or Al-Qadir, the all-powerful, Al-Muqtadir, the creator of all power, Al-Muqaddam, the expediter, Al-Mu'akhar, the delayer, Al-Awwal, the first, Al-Akhar, the last, Al-Ẓāhir, the manifest, Al-Bāṭin, the hidden, Al-Wali, the protecting friend, Al-Muta'ali, the supreme one, Al-Bar, the good, Al-Tawwab, the guide to repentance, Al-Muntaqim, the avenger, Al-Afuwa, the forgiver, Al-Ra'uf, the clement, Malik al-Mulk, the owner of all, Dhul Jalal wal-Ikram, the Lord of majesty and grace, Al-Muqsit, the equitable one, Al-Jamiyah, the gatherer, Al-Qani, the rich, Al-Mughni, the enricher, Al-Ma'mit, the preventer of harm, Al-Dar, the creator of the harmful, Al-Naf, the creator of good, Al-Nur, the light, Al-Hadi, the guide, Al-Badi', the originator, Al-Baqi, the everlasting permanent one, Al-Warith, the inheritor of all, Al-Rashid, the righteous teacher, and As-Sabur, the patient one. These are the 99 names that are mentioned specifically in the Quran. Like I said, there are more of these names in various prayers. Sometimes we're going over 1,000 of these, which becoming themselves for a Sufi or any kind of esoteric Muslim, they become meditation devices by which then one does the path, the practice of the path itself. Now, within the Quran, there are many chapters of the Quran that open with a set of letters that are disconnected. Hurufat muqatta'at. And there are 29 surahs that where this occurs. For example, the very famous one that opens the second surah, Al-Baqarah, Alif Lam Mim, etc. And there are 14 particular letters in 14 sets that occur. And within the world of theurgy, Islamic theurgy, these are known as huruf al-Nuraniyah, the luminous letters. And their opposite are called the huruf al-Zulmaniyah. And these play an extremely important part in all metaphysical speculations within the world of Islamic esotericism. They are meditation devices in their own right. The philosopher Avicenna, who also dabbled in mysticism from time to time, he wrote a very interesting commentary on all of these letters. For example, he writes, that the letters Alif Lam Mim, that open the 2nd, the 3rd, the 29th, the 30th, 31st, and 36th surahs, represents the first principle, Mubda al-Awwal, the source of the creative command, the Am, and the temporal creation. And he lays this all out in a really interesting commentary. The remaining letters were also another set of 14 letters, are known as the Huruf al-Zulmaniya, or the darkened letters. Together, these 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet are then taken to, within the world of esoteric astrology, to represent each of the lunar mansions, the Manazil al-Qamariya, that then many occultists, astrologers, etc. follow during the cycles of the moon, both for establishing the devotions, to map out the start of and ending of the months, and particularly to find out when Ramadan begins, when it ends, and whatnot. So the letters of the Arabic alphabet here are extremely important, just like in Hebrew and also in Sanskrit, where you find that the letters of the alphabet themselves are imbued with a form of sacrality. In this world, Arabic takes that place. So the 28 letters of the Arabic language are taken as being metaphysical ideophanies, right? So within the world of Islamic esotericism, letterism, or the science of the letters, is the crown science of Islamic theurgy and its practice. Whether from the Sufi angle or the esoteric Shia angle, because of the correspondences because these letters constitute the divine names, through which then we can contemplate the mystery of the names and the mystery of the revelation itself. Just like in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and in Hebrew, exactly the same thing occurs. So it is the pith and marrow of the science of Islamic occultism and esotericism as a whole. It is essential for the astrological sciences, and as I mentioned, the 28 lunar mansions, the Manazil al-Qamariya. And the lunar mansions, I should mention, are explicitly mentioned themselves within the 36th surah of the Quran itself. So contrary to what a lot of contemporary fundamentalist figures in the Islamic world state about the verboten nature of sciences such as astrology, they very seldom explain the fact that astrology itself turns up in the Quran, and in a very positive light. As long as the stars are not worshipped in themselves, there's never been a problem, for people to engage in astrology, because this is mapping out time. And a religion such as Islam, just like all the ancient religions itself, is also fixated on the movement of time, the seasons, etc. And that is why astrology, at least until the modern period, played a very central role within all of the Islamic world. In fact, the Munajjim, the astrologer, was not only a patron, wasn't only patronized by kings and sultans and whatnot, but you had your local astrologer on every block. The modern world has changed this trend, and when you have fundamentalist movements like the Salafi or the Wahhabis or etc., who are trying to take that part of the world to a fictitious path that never existed, they look at all of this stuff and they call it kufr, infidelity and heresy. The fact of the matter is, from our point of view and from the point of view of practicing Islamic esotericism, the real heretics, the real kuffar, are these folks rather than us. All earliest material on letterism and astrology, the gematria, etc., are attributed to one of the early Shia Imams, either Ali, alayhi salam, the first Shia Imam, or the sixth Shia Imam, Jafar as-Sadiq, whose leading disciple, as I mentioned before when we were talking, was none other than the Latin Geber, or in the Arabic Jabir ibn Hayyan, who literally spawned the literature that inspired later on medieval Europe and then in the Renaissance into reclaiming the science of alchemy. So alchemy itself has a source within the family of the Prophet, and arguably within the Prophet himself. And so these sciences, the arcana, the occult sciences, etc., as I have mapped out meticulously over the last 20 years through my manuscript research, whether here or in the United States, or last decade when I was in Europe, is proving more and more that the origination of the arcana within the Islamic world actually begins with the family of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and alchemy, etc. And it is through them that a tradition of arcana, and then that goes into different directions, whether in various schools of Shiite esotericism, and then later on, from about the 7th, 8th centuries, into the formation of Tariqa Sufism, that the Sufi orders, all of them have their spawns and their origin within the figures of the Imams, peace be upon them, the family of the Prophet of Islam. And it is within these texts, for example, by Geber or the Jabir ibn Hayyan, where we find then some of these esoteric teachings of Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, about the meaning of the postures, for example, of the Salat. And the way that these are explained resonates completely with the understanding, for example, that the world of yoga has about the various asanas. For example, the first of the positions when a Muslim prays is called the Iqama, where you stand upright. And in these transmitted teachings, the Iqama, with the posture of the body, represents the letter Alif, and the letter Alif is the first letter of Allah. So there is a sort of Platonic mimesis with the body happening, where the person that is praying through the body in sort of a, what I call the lecherous yogic theurgy of the Salat, is invoking the reality to which they are praying to with the postures of the body. By the way, you will not get any of this sort of transmitted teachings if you go to your local mosque here and ask the imam or sheikh, can you explain to me what is the deeper meaning of this? Unless they're a Sufi, they have no idea about any of this. Then, for example, the ruku, which is the next posture of the salat, is the half bent when someone stands, is the ruku, like such. This represents the letter Lam, the L of Arabic. And this is the command, the world, the Amr. It's the universal intellect, or from another perspective, this represents the reality of the Archangel Gabriel, who was the angel of revelation to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So the next posture, the ruku, is invoking the mediator between humanity and God. And it's interesting that in the texts of the later Hermetic tradition, especially in Iran, with an unbelievably influential figure such as Shahabuddin Sohrawardi, he designates the angel Gabriel as being the angel of humanity, right? The sublunary archangel, otherwise known as the active intellect, which is the angel or archangel of the human species in totality. And then the final posture, which is the sujood, when you go into the complete prostration of the ground where the head is touching the ground, this is the letter Mim. And the letter Mim is none other but the first letter of the name Muhammad. So that with the body, with the postures of the Salat, there is this is what I'm saying, this is the mimesis through the postures of the body, where the body and the words and the mind and the mentality and the intention is supposed to saturate itself in the very thing that it is invoking. Now, this is the reason why, and this is what the Sufis explain, why the people who merely follow the path of the law alone, the fiqh, without understanding its inner significance, end up being either rote practitioners without understanding any of the deeper mysteries of what it is that they're practicing, or end up outright becoming in a kind of a exoteric form idolaters of the law. That is why that in this path, and the Quran itself, it says this repeatedly, warning this sort of thing, and why two of the names of God is the outer and the inner, the first and the last, that there is the challenge is to bring all of these together, so that with your entire being, these prayers are being done. With your entire intentionality, all of the various elements of the subtle bodies are being incorporated into the practice of the Salat. In essence, what the intention, the original intention of the salat was exactly what they are doing, have been doing in India or even in China for thousands of years. It's a form of yoga. But like I said, in these times that we're living in, and especially as the tradition has been, at least in the outward level and in public perception and public opinion, been taken over by these fundamentalists, this knowledge is no longer that widely appreciated. But yet, the transmission continues. Now, one of the most important symbols that you will find in the world of Islamic esotericism is this particular symbol, which is known as the greatest name, Ism al-Azam. And this symbol permeates the world of occult manuscripts, and you cannot fail to pick an occult manuscript of any era without having some version or variety of this symbol show up, whether it's in North Africa, in the Middle East, in the Levant, etc. And this symbol has even gone far beyond that. This symbol was actually found in several different slave revolts that happened in the Caribbean and also in Brazil during the 19th century. Apparently it also showed up during the Haitian Revolution of 1789. Of course, Haiti being what it was, many of these African slaves that were taken were also Muslims. So, the Voodoo tradition, as some scholars are beginning to understand now, was actually a syncretic fusion between the various West African systems of sorcery and the Islamic one that came together in places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So this symbol has pretty much gone everywhere around the world. And in Bahia, during the 1850s, it was one of the coded symbols that the African slaves in Bahia used against the Portuguese authorities there. And this symbol is originally transmitted by the first Imam, Ali, alayhi salam. There's a whole story about how he came upon it, but he then transmits this symbol in a poem, which goes like this. 3 sticks in a row, after a seal, above them the semblance of a straightened lance. Then a blind meme without a tail, then a ladder unto all that is hoped for, but which is not a ladder. Then 4 things like fingers in a row pointing to good deeds, but without a wrist, and a ha that has been split, then an inverted wow, letter wow inverted, like the siphon of a phlebotomist, but not a bloodletting cup. This is the name whose worth is magnified. If you were ignorant of it before, know it now. O bearer of the great name, take sufficiency in it. You shall be preserved from all misfortunes and shall be kept safe. It is the secret name of God. May His glory be glorified unto all men, be they Arab or non-Arab. Now this symbol is not a word, although words and letters can be extracted from it, and I have my own magical extractions that I have, letters that I've associated with these. Others have done the same, but in itself it is a calligram. It is not an actual word. Angels and angelic names have been associated, the traditional one, and also the days of the week. For example, the name of God, Fard, the single, is usually associated in the text with the pentagram, and then the archangel Ruqya'il, which is a version of the archangel Metatron in the early Arabic text. Then the next one is associated with the letter Jim and the name Jabbar, the compeller, the archangel Gabriel, Jibreel. Then the following one has been associated with the letter Shin and the name Shakur, giver of thanks, and what in Arabic text is called the archangel Samsamail, or although in Kabbalistic text Samail is actually a demon and not an angel, but in the Islamic culture, this Samail has become Samsamail and an archangel. Then the next is associated with the letter Tha and the word Thabit, the immutable, and the archangel Mikael or Michael. That one there has been associated with the letter Dha, the word Ẓāhir, the manifest, and the archangel Sarfiel or Israfil, Raphael. The next one has been associated with the divine name Khabir, the well-informed, and the archangel Anyail, which is Anael in the Hebrew or the Kabbalistic form. And the last one, this one, has been associated with the name Zaki, the pure, and the archangel Caspian. Then the days of the week are then associated with each of these sigils. So for example, this is Sunday, the star, the pentagram is Sunday. The next one is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday again is the final one. I'll speak a little bit about what all of this leads to. That is a very important doctrine that then shows up pretty much in all of the various esoteric branches of Islam. And that is the doctrine of, at least in the Western magical tradition, is known as the doctrine of the Holy Guardian Angel, that all has a hermetic, historical root, but also finds itself being articulated, especially within the corpus of Shia Hadith in the very early period, by the Shia Imams. For example, there's a very famous Hadith in the very first book of Khulaini's Al-Kafi, which is one of the major canonical texts of Shia Hadith, where the sixth Imam, Jafar as-Sadiq, very matter-of-factly tells his disciple that in the world of existence there are two proofs to humanity from God. The first one are the prophet, the messengers, and the saints. These are the outward proofs to humanity about the existence of God. But then, more important than them, there is the hidden proof, and that is the aql, that is the nexo consciousness, the intelligence that abides within each human being. And where this idea is then taken by later generation of Shiites, whether Twelver Shiites or Ismailis, they speak about the imam of one's being. So that each individual not only has an outward imam, but the imam of their being to which that imam initiator is leading them to. So that the imam, in a sense, is both an outward reality, but an inward reality. The Ẓāhir, the manifest, and the Bāṭin, the inner. But this idea is nowhere better articulated than in the writings, and specifically one particular prayer by this Persian illuminationist philosopher by the name of, that I mentioned, Shahabuddin Yahya Suhrawardi. This man was an amazing philosopher, hermeticist, mystic, died at the very young age of 38 at the hands of Saladin for very similar claims that were made against Socrates for corrupting Saladin's son, Malik Ẓāhir Shah. This 38-year-old had come from Iran and had traveled all and was an itinerant. He hung out with Sufis, and he was one of the most amazing syncretic figures of that period. He conjoined the names of Zarathustra with Muḥammad and the Abrahamic lineage, and then threw Hermes in the mix. So his whole entire, historical prophetology contained not only the names of the Abrahamic prophets, but also the Indo-Aryan prophets like Zarathustra, etc. He invoked the names of the ancient Egyptian priest kings, believed that there was a secret order of sages in pre-Islamic Iran that he called the Khosrawani sages, and his doctrine is essentially a form of what one would call a hermetic and Neoplatonized form of Sufism. And he has a prayer in one of his corpus. It's called the Hymn to the Perfect Nature, where in this prayer, what the nature of the perfect nature, the holy guardian angel is actually spelled out. And he says, I read my translation of this thing. But first he gives a whole bunch of instructions about what one must do, fasting and doing a retreat for 40 days, etc.
Is this where the Creatrix gets that from?
Well, this Suhrawardi is technically after the Creatrix, but this whole idea of the perfect nature, the guardian angel, has a history. But with Suhrawardi, it is the most explicit form of this doctrine that we found. But let me read you this prayer, because in this prayer, the actual doctrine of the perfect nature, the holy guardian angel, is very explicitly spelled out. He says, O thou, my Lord and Prince, most holy angel, my most precious and beloved spiritual being, thou art my father and my mother, the sun and the moon, who gave birth to me in the world of the pure spirit. And thou art, my holy guardian angel, my child and sibling in the sublimity of my thought. With divine permission, thou art entirely dedicated to the government of my person. Thou art the one whose fervor intercedes for me before the Godhead, the God of all gods, to make up for my deficiencies. O thou who art clothed in the utmost radiance of the divine lights, O thou who resides at the summit of the degrees of perfection, I implore thee, through the one who has overwhelmed thee with such sublime nobility, who has bestowed upon thee such an immense effusion of grace. O precious one, may thou manifest thyself to me at the hour of the supreme epiphany. May thou showest me thy splendorous face. May thou be my mediator before the God of gods in the effusion of the cymatic light of mystical secrets. May thou lift the veils of darkness from my heart. This I pray, in the name of the one who hath claim over thee and ranks over thee. I call upon thee, O powers and sublime spiritual angels, O ye who are the wisdom of the sages, the sagacity of the seers, and the knowledge of the wise. Hearken unto me and appear before me and bring me near to thy magisterium. Guide me with thy wisdom and protect me with thy powers. Make me understand what I do not understand, realize what I do not realize, and see what I do not see. Turn me away from the dangers that lurk in the ignorance, the forgetfulness, and the hardness of my heart, in order to have me attain to the ranks of the ancient sages and the inspired prophets and messengers, in whose hearts wisdom, insight, vigilance, discernment, and comprehension made their permanent indwelling. May thou also live forever in the innermost recesses of my heart and never ever separate thyself from me. Amen. So within this prayer, this ecstatic prayer by Socrates, an entire doctrine of what it is, the holy guardian angel is disclosed. But when one reads this is the more hermetic denotation of what this idea is. There is a very famous dialogue between Ali, the first Imam, and his disciple, Kumail, known as the Hadith al-Haqiqa, or the tradition of ultimate reality, where this discourse itself not only reveals the nature of ultimate reality between a master and his disciple, but is also ultimately the gloss on what the meaning of the holy guardian angel is. And I'll read it to you. This dialogue goes as such. Kumail, the disciple, comes to his master Ali and says, O commander of the faithful, what is ultimate or absolute reality? Mal haqiqa. And Ali responds, what have you and ultimate reality to do with each other? Kumail responds, is it not the case that I'm already sharing your secrets as your companion? Ali says, yes indeed, but that which sprinkles unto you is billowing through me unto you. And then Kumail insists again, so master, what is ultimate reality? Ali says, the disclosure of the majesties of glorification without indication. Kumail doesn't understand. Master, please explain further. Zadani bayana. Ali says, the negation of all speculation and the realization of that which can be realized. Mahbal mawhum ma sahbal malum. Please tell me more. Zadani bayana. The nullificative annihilation of the secret by the victorious rending of the veil off the mystery of the secret. Kumail insists, please explicate further, Master. Ali says, the attraction of the divine oneness by the attributive apprehension of the divine unicity. Kumail pushes him further. Please elucidate further. Ali says, a light illuminating from the dawn of pre-eternity and shedding its traces upon the tablets of the talismanic temples of unicity. Kumail pushes him, please explain, Master, what are you talking about? Ali ends the discussion. Extinguish the lamp, for the dawn hath arisen. Now, I have spent the last 30 years contemplating the Zen-like discourse between Ali, first Imam, and his disciple Kumail. And about 10-15 years ago, one of the transmitted dreams I had gave me a prayer, and I'll end this part of the discussion with it. And this is one of my own personal prayers that I use every morning when I get up. And it goes like this. It is about the Hadith Kumail, this tradition of ultimate reality. And it starts as this: in the name of God, the most praised, the most glorified, the most holy, in the highest altitude of the sanctification and the glorification of the holiness of elevated sublimity and transcendence. O thou who are the light of all lights, effusing the illumination of the radiance of thy being by the blinding godly scintillance of the dazzling divine brilliance from the fire of the morning dawn arisen. O my God, verily I testify at the throne of the resplendent sun of thy pre-eternal oneness, which hath ignited the manifestations of those flames of holiness, flaring the flares of the mirrored rays of the revelation of the unity of thy glory, self-disclosing the theophanic transfigurations of the manifestation of thy solitary, most singular and unchanging face, which hath already always annihilated all things. And thou, who art that inhabitant sovereign of the horizons of myself, unveiling the singularity of thy perspicuous reality within the selves of my horizon. Thou art indeed the most manifest and the most hidden, as the absolute manifestation of the ultimately hidden. I verily, O my God, testify that thou art that who hath left thy traces imprinted upon the talismanic temples of thy unicity, by the vestigial signs of the unificating, ecstatic attractions of thy unicitarianism, of thy unicity, from a firstness before all firstness unto a lastness after all lastness. O my God, I verily testify at the vision-effacing, nullificative annihilation of the secret, by the victorious rending of the veils of the secreted mysteries of thy secret, through the apophatic negation of all speculation and the realization of that realized reality that is thee alone, the truly real. For I verily, O my God, testify by the disclosure of the regalitude of thy majesties of glorification without indication, from the locus of thy post-eternity, the situs of thy everlastingness, within the axis of thy durationless perpetuity, by the unveilings of thy endlessness, from a beginning of no beginning unto an end of no end. For thou art the Godhead. There is no other God but thee alone, within thee alone, by thee alone, from thee alone, and to thee alone, truly, truly. Amen. Questions?
Yes. I have a question. In the beginning you were talking about the manifest and the hidden. The hidden was represented as the feminine,
Yes.
Eve. And so there's some kind of approach that we are the manifest and we're trying to head towards the hidden. So there's this,
Yes.
I don't know, tantric connotation or something.
Yes.
It kind of reminded me of in the Ẓāhir how they split God into two. There's a transcendental God and then there's an
Inner God, yeah.
inner God, and that's
Yeah.
feminine. So and
It's interesting because even with in the metaphysical architecture of, like, for example, a figure like Ibn Arabi, this gets even more interesting. Because this whole male-female thing gets extremely dense. But one thing that he says in his magnum opus, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Revelations, he actually says that the ultimate mystery of the Godhead is the female. And so the pronoun hiya, she, is beyond the hoa, which is the he. And within the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, for example, he divides, just like you find in the Kabbalah, where we have the Ein Sof, Aur, etc. Within Ibn Arabi, you have this idea of where he's speaking of the essence, the ahadiyya and the wahidiyya, the exclusive oneness and the inclusive unity. The ahadiyya comes first, and that is a she, and then it is followed by the inclusive unity, which is a he. And then all the way that this trickles down to the world, so within, for example, within that poem by Ibn al-Farid that I read at the beginning, God appears through Eve to Adam. But Adam himself is the first man, who's the prototype, at least in all of Sufi literature, of the Insan Kamil. In the Kabbalah, Adam is the face, he's the Ẓāhir, Anpi in the face within the tree, etc. These ideas are completely recognized within Sufism itself. Well, so the male God, right? The mystery of the male God itself is the woman within.
Yes.
Right? So there are traditions within certain esoteric Shiite schools where they say that the heart of God is the mother. And for example, there's these hadith that are attributed to Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he calls his own 5-year-old daughter at the time, Fatima, Abiha, the mother of her father. And these are these koans that are contemplate on, and then these amazing discourses of the nature of the metaphysics are written. But with Ibn Arabi, he is explicit that says that when we're talking about that, the essence, which itself is a feminine word in Arabic, we are speaking about the reality, the metaphysical reality of the female. I say this to people. A lot of people sometimes get jaded that when you're talking about pristine Sufism, and especially the metaphysics of a figure like Ibn Arabi, and then even the Shia, you are talking in a sense about a form of Abrahamic goddess worship. Now, because the culture is patriarchal, misogynist, and all that kind of stuff, and there have been reactions to this stuff. The Sufis have had to be very careful and had to craft this thing and contextualize it in certain ways. It didn't offend the sensibilities of the blockheads. But the truth is that when you read the texts themselves, they are very open about this stuff and how they contextualize it.
So the process of walking towards the feminine is to first connect to the inner imam.
Yes.
Okay.
Which happens through the initiation. So once the initiation happens, that ignition switch to the inner imam has begun. And then you approach the woman. There's a very amazing gloss on the nature of the fall of Adam in this extremely esoteric 19th century commentary on the second surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, where the author, Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi, he had never had any access to Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi hadn't even been found at that point. But he says, he has this aside that I have been contemplating over the last 20 years since the first time I read it, where he says that Adam's mistake and the whole reason of the fall out of the garden is that he approached his wife the wrong way. He didn't realize that his wife was a manifestation of God. So because he didn't realize who Eve was, then he uses all this imagery of the tree and Eve is the transfiguration of Fatima, so that Shiite elements, so Eve and Fatima are the same. Because Adam didn't recognize it, even though Adam is the first man, that's where the fall happens, because of his lack of insight. And this then becomes a kind of a narrative, a motif, about the initiation. And this is Adam we're talking about, which in all of the esoteric texts in Islam, God teaches them the names of things, he names things, the realities of things come into being through the word of Adam. But yet in this story of the fall of Adam, because he didn't realize who his wife was, echoing that poem from Ibn Farid, that is where the fall happens. So the incorrect approach to the female as divine is what precipitates the fall.
You mentioned at one point those who are just the followers of the law. Maybe you call them the blockheads.
Yeah.
Right. But in Gnosis, there's these three tiers of the those who just follow the law. And there's the middle tier is the psychics or the soul who understand everything on a soul level, and then there's the top tier. The word came to me. I'm not sure if it's the right word. It's ijma.
Yeah.
Is that the right word for spirit?
Ijma means consensus.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's maybe it's not the right. That's not the word I'm looking for. But
you're talking about the three: the Halics, the psychics, and the pneumatics. From
the pneumatics. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Is there a similar? Grading in Islam?
All of these schools speak about the types of humanity. For example, the Imams in their teaching speak about. It's very interesting how they put it too. It's been a point of controversy for a long time. They talk about the awam, the generality, and they actually call the awam, the generality, the Muslims. And then they call their own disciples and own initiates mu'minun, the believers. So within the teachings of the Shiite, early Shiite Imams, there's a distinction between the generality where the Muslims, they follow the law, they don't understand, they're hostile to the esotericism and the gnosis. They're not the believers, they're the submitters. But our people, our initiates, are the mu'minun, are the believers. And so this word iman, belief, within the lexicon of esoteric Shiism is actually not just belief or faith. It means someone who was initiated into the gnosis by the imam initiator. So yes, absolutely, you have this distinction. And then within the various texts of Sufism, this is also broken down into different kinds. Sohrawardi, for example, at the very beginning of his magnum opus, Hikmat al-Ishraq, talks about the 5 kinds of people, that approach a spiritual path. The generality, and then those who only rely on their partial intellect as being the next step above it, and then those who only follow their intuition, and then there are those who bring both the reason and the intuition together, and he calls the imam of all realizers. The true master is one who has both synthesized both the external knowledge of the world of the sciences and also has perfected the intuitive path or the esoteric path. So realized both the outer and the inner simultaneously. And in Plato, you also have this within Plato himself, where he talks about the different kinds of knowing, the doxa, the general opinion, the ratio, the ratiocinate knowledge. And then he speaks about the noesis, which is that intuitive knowledge that he's trying, that in particularly dialogue like the symposium, that the figure of Diotima puts her finger on.
We say that the Salafis and the Wahhabis, like the bottom tier has risen to the top and trying
well,
to...
in at least, yeah, on the external level of representation, these people have risen to the top and completely corrupted the tradition. I can't emphasize this enough. What these people represent, there were tendencies to this effect from the very beginning, and these have been tensions that have existed within the Islamic world from the moment the Prophet closed his eyes for the world. But what the Wahhabi or the Salafist represent was considered at an earlier age to be an aberration. In fact, the intellectual figure that the Wahhabis and the Salafists laud as their paragon intellectuals, a figure like Ibn Taymiyyah, who in his own day had fatwas passed against him for being an extremist. So the mainstream of the day against Ibn Taymiyyah considered this guy to be completely nuts. This guy was crazy in some of his advocacy of things. But what modernism has done, and this is an extremely complex discussion. The Islamic world's encounter with modernity was a very traumatic one, because all of a sudden, because for centuries Islam was the Islamic world was at the top of the civilizational paradigm, because of the Mongol invasion and whatnot, also because civilizations all have their cycle and they became when the Europeans arrived with steamboats and guns and etc. It became a very traumatic experience, especially when you had then, if not by geographic conquest, you had by economic conquest that part of the world. It became very traumatizing, and so you had people in that part of the world rejecting what had come before. So the first place they began to point at was the Sufi orders, that the Sufi orders had corrupted Islam and yada yada yada. And so people and figures like Muḥammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was the founder of the Wahhabi school, got a easy hearing from certain people. Although if you're a philosopher or mystic and you read this guy, he comes across as a complete lunatic, but what he's saying in extreme. But because of this traumatic experience, these sorts of ideologies found fertile ground. Now, whether this is going to change, I see positive movement into another direction. I think probably in the next 50 years or so, I think we will begin to see a shift in different directions, because even the ruling family of Saudi Arabia itself is starting to become weary of Wahhabism. You see this with MBS himself, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, that he is, I'm not a big fan of his or the House of Saud at all, but even he is realizing that where the Wahhabi doctrine has taken the kingdom is down the blind alley. And if a kingdom like Saudi Arabia, who runs out of oil in the next 10 years, is to compete, it needs to open up. It needs to have an educated populace. Women need to be educated. We need women professionals. So they're now, for example, only in the last 18 months to 2 years, women now have the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, although in Iran this has been the case for the last 50 years. By the same token, Iran itself, over the last 40 plus years, has had a massive brain drain because the Ayatollahs from the seminaries have tried to push on the Iranian people and suppressing the Sufi orders, suppressing esoteric and theosophical tendencies within even the seminary itself, even though many people would be surprised to know that Ayatollah Khomeini himself was a teacher of Islamic philosophy and Islamic gnosis. But his heirs and his inheritors turned their back on all of this, and because they saw, for example, the Sufi brotherhoods as being a rival to the power of the state, of theocracy. But now even that is having a reaction amongst the population in Iran, and I don't see a future for that theocracy in Iran in the next 10 years. Once that is gone, then you'll see another a process unfold. But there's another problem, and that is a problem that I've repeatedly encountered, is that there are certain interests in the West itself that don't want to see a esoteric Islam or a Sufism emerge as the front face of Islam. They are benefiting from this extremist, backward, obscurantist vision of Islam and the Islamic world. Even though the Renaissance and the flowering of Europe out of the Middle Ages was spawned by the transmission and the knowledge sharing, especially in the sciences between the Islamic world and Europe. I was telling Adam in the car over here that the Vatican has over about 900 years worth of manuscripts, of Islamic manuscripts, sitting in its vaults that they're not opening to the world. We don't even know what these people have. So there's scientific treatises, the cult man, all kinds of interesting stuff in these vaults. If they opened up, we'd get a gauge exactly of what Europe was getting during this 900-year period from the Islamic world. But, this whole fictitious, in my opinion, clash of civilizations that we've been encountering over the last 20-something odd years, there's certain interests that are making money off of it, and if you get another version of Islam that is much different, much more progressive, much more, open and exploratory and esoteric, and a lot of these people would stand to lose a lot of money. But in circles like this and talks like this, I always get this question: well, what about these folks? And then explain the history to them. This is what's going on. Yeah.
I have a question about the Imam, the initiator. So, from my what I'm gauging, it's almost like that's the middle figure, like the holy, I don't know, we'd call it like the holy, Christ self-holy, Buddha self-holy, whatever. The mediator between you and then the ultimate Godhead.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so, is that then something that you would compare with your inner tuition, your inner tutor, inner teacher?
Sure. The point of the human initiator is to, like I said, is to turn the switch on the vehicle, so that ultimately the student or novice realizes their own, imam of their own being, their own holy guardian angel. So in the language of this, Western ceremonial magicians, once you have crossed the abyss and attained conversation with the holy guardian angel, then the job of that imam initiator, the physical human one, is done. Because at that point you yourself are then the imam initiator, once you've crossed the abyss and have gained permanent conversation with the angel, or your inner self. But there's another way to look at it, that the imam initiator in a sense is the Godhead's own veil of light. It is the manifestation of God at that period, in a specific locus of that person. In the tariqa, in the Sufi orders, especially in Iran, and this is extremely heretical to most people, one of the first things that they teach you once you're initiated and given your zikr, your invocation, is that for at least for a certain period of time, you are to focus on the face of your teacher, right? In fact, you are to perfect idolatry. And this in Sufism is known as the kufr al-ghari, the true infidelity. So that you create such a idol out of your teacher that then the alchemy of the invocation and the teacher within yourself breaks. So there's a process of solving a coagula happening. Once that breaks, then the image of the human teacher dissolves, and then you realize that you have been in the presence of the eternal teacher the whole time. And whether people actually get to realize that over a given period of time, that's something that their own efforts has to realize.
In modern days, teachers are hard to come by. Is it possible to gain conversation without a teacher?
Yeah, well, I only had my physical teacher, my sheikh, for only 6 years. He was a sick man. He had cancer, so and I've told this story many times. And as he realized that I was about to become orphaned spiritually, he told me, he said, look, I've given you everything that I can in this short period of time. From this point on, this is your teacher. He says you are to meditate on this symbol, and everything that you will get, you will get from it. And that's what I did, and it did. And then the dream world, the things that happen in the inner and the outer, and I could write books and books, where you begin to then realize what this nexus between the inner and outer was. You find something very similar in certain ashrams, where yantras, for example, once the guru initiates, the novice tantrika, at a certain point, they have no interaction with the human teacher anymore. It's only through the medium of the yantras and the various mantras that come with the yantras. He did exactly the same thing with me.
Speaking of writing books, have you written a book?
Yeah, I have a grimoire that I self-published. It's almost, what is it now? It's about 14 years ago that it's online, but I have enough material that I've accumulated over the last 20 years for multi-volumes, 30, 40 books easily. Translations and...
But you don't have any physical ones?
Not physical ones on me, no. Right now.
You've got a grimoire.
Yeah. A grimoire, yeah. I self-published grimoire, yeah.
So...
That's a magical text.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, just my experiences for a particular period of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can we access that?
Yeah, I've actually put it online on my Academia EDU page. It's on my...
Maybe this is a good time to tell people where they can find you.
You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Academia EDU. I have a blog. You have better handwriting than I do. Just on Facebook. Yeah, on Facebook. Just put my name. You can find me there. And you can get me on email. I can direct you to all of this stuff.
Yeah, and so other than your online book, are there any other suggestions for further reading as like introductory introductory topic to
Sure.
preaching,
Anyone who comes to me and they ask they want to learn about this tradition, I send them immediately to the French neuronologist Henri Corbin. And yeah.
Is it Henry Corbin?
Yeah.
It's the English, but Henry Corbin.
Henri Corbin, yeah. And he was a prolific scholar, but at the same time he was actually, the opinion of many people, probably, in my opinion, he was the greatest Western esotericist in the 20th century. He was not only a scholar, but he was a full-blown ecstatic Gnostic at the same time, which is why the current academy doesn't like him very much.
the current academy of what?
The university systems in the social science, humanities disciplines. Because he became a believer, and in that setting you're supposed to be always a neutral and non-believer, and etc. Henry Corbin, and especially his books, Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, that would be the book. It is a dense book, but once you engage with this book, this man basically takes you into another world. And he begins to explain and unfold certain things that are quite profound. And amongst, people who are in this particular tradition, All of us who read Quran know that this guy knew what he was talking about. He had seen, he had experienced what he was writing. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.